Mom abandoned me for her new family, then tried to take my apartment. Hey everyone, I'm Alex, and I want to share a bit about my past. I grew up in this small, creaky house that always smelled of paint and turpentine. It wasn't fancy or anything, just cozy and filled with the kind of warmth you don't really find in a lot of places. My dad inherited his dad's art supply shop when I was just a kid, and even though the business wasn't huge, he put everything into it. And honestly, I loved it. After school, I'd help him restock the shelves, organize paintbrushes, and set up canvases. It was kind of our thing. Now, my mom, Stacy, she was different. She wasn't into the art stuff at all. She was a personal trainer, always out there in her workout clothes, super fit, and honestly, she made way more money than my dad ever did. She was the kind of person who liked to show off, always talking about her clients and their fancy lifestyles. It was like she never really fit into the life we had at home. She didn't care much for the art shop or the little things that made our place special. But hey, that was her. I remember this one night so clearly. I must have been around 13. I was in my room sketching in this old notebook my dad gave me when I heard her calling, Alex, come help with dinner! Her voice had that sharp edge to it like she wasn't asking, more like ordering. I yelled back, coming, and set my pencil down. By then, I was used to it. It was always like this, me stuck in the middle of their fights. I walked into the kitchen and started setting the table, and right on cue, it started. Another slow week, Jack, Mom said, like she was dropping some kind of bomb. She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter, her expression sour. When are you going to get your act together? She added, and you could feel the tension in the air. Dad, who was flipping pancakes on the stove, just sighed. Stacy, not in front of Alex, he mumbled, keeping his eyes on the pan, like if he stared hard enough, he could disappear into it. But she didn't back off. She should know what a failure her father is, she shot back, her voice like ice. I froze for a second, my hand gripping the edge of the table. It was like this all the time, and I hated it. Mom always belittling Dad, and him just taking it, trying to keep the peace. I mean, I loved my dad. He was the one who was always there for me, always trying his best to make things work, even when things were rough. But it was like no matter what he did, it wasn't good enough for her. Mom didn't like our life. I could tell. She was always talking about her clients, the ones with the fancy cars and the huge houses. It was like she resented the small art shop and the house that smelled of paint and old wood. She used to complain about how she was stuck in a life she never wanted, and I guess she took it out on us. Mostly Dad, but sometimes me too. Alex, where's my water? She snapped, pulling me out of my thoughts. I scrambled to grab a glass and fill it, my hands shaking a little as I set it down in front of her. It wasn't fast enough for her liking, I guess, because she glared at me. Useless, she muttered under her breath. Can't even get a simple thing right. Dad tried to step in like he always did. Stacy, it's just water. No harm done. But she wasn't having any of it. You're too soft on her, Jack. No wonder she's growing up just as pathetic as you. I felt my face get hot. I wanted to say something, anything, but what was the point? If I argued, it would just get worse. I'd learned by then to just stay quiet, keep my head down, and get through it. So I did what I always did. I fled. I ran up to my room, slammed the door behind me, and just threw myself onto my bed, burying my face in the pillow. I remember laying there, feeling my heart race, trying to keep the tears in. It wasn't fair. Why did she have to be like this? And why did Dad put up with it? I knew he loved her. I mean, he must have. But it was like he was always trying to keep everything together when she clearly didn't care. And as much as I hated to admit it, I started feeling like maybe he was too soft. Maybe if he just stood up to her, things would be different. The thing is, I learned to stay out of her way as much as I could. I'd hide out in my room or go down to the shop with Dad when she wasn't around. If I could avoid her sharp comments or her judgmental stares, I did. It was easier that way. I got really good at being invisible, you know? Just staying out of the line of fire. The next morning was different, though. I woke up expecting the usual sounds. Dad in the kitchen making breakfast, the smell of coffee, the clatter of dishes. But it was silent. And not the peaceful kind of silence, more like the something's off kind. There was no smell of pancakes, no shuffling from the kitchen. I sat up, feeling a weird pit in my stomach. When I walked downstairs, it was like walking into a different house. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at this piece of paper in his hand. His face was pale, and he looked older than he had the day before. Dad? I said, my voice small. Where's Mom? He didn't answer right away. He just handed me the note, his hand shaking a little. I took it, already feeling that dread in my stomach grow. It was written in Mom's neat handwriting. Way too neat for what it said. Jack, I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving with Ryan. He can give me the life I deserve, not this small-town nonsense. Alex, don't bother trying to find me. You're just dead weight, and I don't need either of you holding me back. I stood there, staring at the paper, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. She was gone. Just like that. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. And the way she said it, like we meant nothing, like we were just things she could discard. My throat tightened, and I shoved the note back at Dad, trying not to cry. He looked at me, his eyes tired and sad. I'm sorry, Alex, he said, his voice cracking a little. I know this is hard. I didn't know what to say. What was I supposed to say? It's fine, I managed to mumble, but it wasn't. It wasn't fine at all. She left us. She really left us. Dad tried to pull me into a hug, but I pulled away, heading back up to my room. I didn't want him to see how much it hurt. I didn't want him to feel guilty for something that wasn't his fault. But I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just changed, and it wasn't going back to normal anytime soon. After Mom left, things changed fast. I mean, it was like everything flipped upside down, and we had to figure out a whole new normal. I remember Dad sitting at the kitchen table for what felt like days, just staring at nothing. The art shop, the house, even me. I think it all felt like too much for him. And honestly, I didn't blame him. I felt the same way, like everything was heavier, like we were walking through mud or something. For a while, it was just survival mode. I was 13, and suddenly it was just me and Dad in this house that felt way too big now. I started taking on more around the house, not because Dad asked, but because I could tell he was struggling. He tried, you know? He'd wake up early, make breakfast, but it was half-hearted. Like, he'd burn the toast or forget to add sugar to the coffee. It was weird seeing him like that because he was always the one who had it together when I was growing up. He threw himself into work, and I mean, he really threw himself into it. The art shop became his whole world. If he wasn't at home, he was there, painting, organizing, or chatting with the few customers we still had. I think it was his way of coping, just burying himself in the one thing he had control over. It was tough for me too, but I tried to help where I could. After school, I'd head straight to the shop, do my homework at the counter, and restock the shelves. I even learned how to handle the register and started sketching again just to feel normal. But money was tight. Without Mom's income, we were basically scraping by. There were weeks when the shop barely made enough to cover bills, and I could see the stress eating at Dad. He tried to hide it, but I'd catch him checking the bank statements, rubbing his eyes like he was trying to erase the numbers. One day, a few months after she left, I came home from school, and he was sitting at the table with all these papers spread out. Bills, loan statements, all kinds of stuff. Alex, sit down, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. We need to talk. I sat, my stomach twisting. I knew things were bad, but hearing him actually say it made it real. We're behind on the mortgage, he said, and I could see the defeat in his eyes. If we don't start making more money soon, we could lose the house. It was a lot to process. I was just a kid, but even I knew that losing the house would be like losing everything. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and tried to act like I understood how serious it was. Is there anything I can do? I asked, and I meant it. I was scared, but I didn't want him to feel like he had to carry it all alone. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're already doing a lot, Alex. We'll figure it out. And we did try to figure it out. Dad started taking on extra projects, offering art classes at the shop on weekends. We put up flyers at the local schools and community centers, trying to get people interested. I'd help set up the tables, fill the cups with water for the brushes, and clean up after the kids left. Some days it felt like we were making progress. The shop would be buzzing with activity, and we'd have a little extra cash coming in. But other days, it felt like we were just treading water. The bills kept piling up, and there were nights when I'd hear Dad pacing in the living room, the floorboards creaking under his feet. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to block out the sound. I hated feeling helpless. I wanted to fix things, to make it all go back to how it was before. But I couldn't. One afternoon, about a year later, Dad came home with some news that felt like a small win. He'd found a new supplier for art materials, and they were offering way cheaper prices. It meant we could expand our inventory and maybe attract more customers. This could be the break we need, he said, and for the first time in months, I saw a spark of hope in his eyes. We spent that weekend reorganizing the shop, setting up new displays, and promoting the new stock. We even launched a small campaign on social media, posting pictures of the new supplies and offering discounts for the first week. I was learning a lot, not just about running a shop, but about the hustle that came with it. It wasn't easy, but it felt good to see some life back in the place. Things started picking up, slowly but surely. We got more regular customers, teachers, students, local artists, and the art classes became a hit. There was one day when I looked around the shop, and it was packed. People were browsing, kids were painting at the back tables, and Dad was in his element, chatting with everyone like he'd known them forever. It was the happiest I'd seen him since Mom left. For the next 2 years, we just kept building on that momentum. I was 15 by then, and the shop had become my second home. I knew the regulars by name, knew which brushes and paints they liked, and even started helping with the bookkeeping. Dad and I became a team, and in a weird way, I felt proud of what we were doing. It wasn't the life we'd had before, but it was something we built together. Then, just after my 15th birthday, everything changed again. Dad came home from the shop one night looking pale and shaken. I was in the kitchen making sandwiches when he walked in, his hands trembling as he pulled out a chair. Alex, we need to talk. I put down the knife, my heart starting to race. What's wrong? I asked, the anxiety creeping back in. He took a deep breath, his eyes locked on the table. Uncle Benny, he passed away. I was stunned. Uncle Benny was Dad's older brother, and even though we didn't see him often, he was still family. I remember him as this grumpy but kind guy who'd visit us a couple of times a year, always bringing some weird gadget or knick-knack he found on his travels. What happened? I managed to say, feeling a lump form in my throat. Dad shook his head. Heart attack. It was sudden. He paused, then added, he didn't have any other family, so everything's coming to us. What do you mean? I asked, confused. He left us everything, his savings, his house, everything. Almost $150,000, Dad said, his voice a mix of shock and disbelief. I don't know what to do with it. I didn't know either. We'd been struggling for so long that the idea of suddenly having that much money didn't feel real. It was like I couldn't process it. What are we going to do? I asked. And for the first time in a long time, I saw Dad smile, like he was seeing a way out of all the stress. We're going to fix things, Alex, he said, his eyes lighting up. This is our chance. And just like that, it felt like things might finally be turning around. A couple of years after Uncle Benny's inheritance helped us out, things really started to change for the better. Dad used a chunk of that money to expand the art shop. He upgraded the equipment, brought in more supplies, and even opened a second location in town. It was amazing to see how much things improved. We went from struggling to making a solid income, and the shop became a local favorite. I'd watch him, grinning ear to ear, as people came in, excited to buy supplies or sign up for his art classes. By the time I was 18, we were doing well enough that Dad surprised me with the biggest gift of my life, a small apartment near campus. It's your graduation gift, he said, handing me the keys with a proud smile. I don't want you worrying about dorm life or rent. I remember staring at him, completely speechless. It felt like all his hard work had paid off, and he was sharing that success with me. College was a whirlwind. I dove into my studies, focusing on business management so I could help Dad with the shops even more. We still made time for each other, dinners, quick calls, and whenever I came home for the weekend, I'd work at the shop. It was a routine that made everything feel stable and right. But then, just when it seemed like life couldn't get any better, it all came crashing down. I was in my final semester of college when I got a call from Dad. His voice sounded off, and it instantly put me on edge. Alex, can you come home this weekend? I need to talk to you about something important. That pit in my stomach grew as I made the drive back. I had no idea what was going on, but I could tell it was serious. When I walked into the house, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, looking older than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were tired, his face pale. It's cancer, Alex. Stage 4, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt the world tilt. I couldn't believe it. I refused to believe it. But no matter how much I tried to stay positive, the next year was the hardest of my life. Treatments, hospital visits, trying to juggle school and being there for him. It was a lot. I watched as he slowly got weaker, and it broke me inside. No matter how hard we fought, it wasn't enough. Dad passed away just before my college graduation. It felt like everything had been ripped away from me. The funeral was a blur of tears and people I barely knew telling me how sorry they were. All I could think about was how unfair it was that he worked so hard, only to be taken away like this. After he passed, I inherited the art shops, the house, and the apartment he'd given me. It felt overwhelming. I was just 22, and suddenly I was running a business and managing properties on my own. It was a lot to handle, and there were days when I felt like I was drowning. But I pushed through. I knew it was what he'd want. I kept the shops running and managed the apartments, trying to honor everything he'd built. Life slowly started to feel normal again. I settled into a routine, work, managing the rentals, and trying to take care of the shops like Dad had. It wasn't easy, but it gave me a sense of purpose. And just when I thought things were finally stabilizing, that's when she showed up. It had been a little over a year since Dad passed when I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before picking it up, but curiosity got the better of me. Alex, it's me, Stacy, the voice said. I froze. My mom, the woman who left me and Dad when I was 13 and never looked back. I'm back in town, she continued, her voice sounding way too casual for what she was saying. I'd like to see you if you're willing. I was speechless. For years, I'd heard nothing from her. She abandoned us and didn't even try to reach out when Dad passed away. And now, out of nowhere, she wanted to talk. Part of me wanted to hang up right then and there. But another part, the part of me that remembered being a kid and wishing she'd come back, couldn't help but be curious. All right, I said, my voice coming out a lot colder than I expected. Where? Let's meet at Rosie's Cafe tomorrow at noon, she said, and hung up before I could say anything else. The next day, I got to the cafe early. I sat there, my leg bouncing up and down as I tried to keep my nerves in check. I told myself not to expect anything, that she was probably just back for something she needed. And when she finally walked in, it was like I'd been punched in the gut. She looked older, but she still had that same polished look, like she just came from some business meeting. But what shocked me the most was the kid trailing behind her. He looked about 16, just a couple of years younger than me when she left. My eyes narrowed as they walked over. What was she playing at? Alex, you look great, she said, smiling like we were long-lost friends. And this is Max, your brother. My brother? I stared at the kid, who gave me an awkward smile. She had a whole new family? While Dad and I were struggling to keep things together, she was out there building a new life. I felt a lump form in my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. Hi, Max, I said, my voice flat. We sat down and she started talking like nothing was wrong. She told me about how her relationship with her boyfriend Ryan had fallen apart when Max was little, how she moved from place to place, struggling to make ends meet. She said she came back to start fresh, and she hoped we could reconnect. I listened, but all I could think about was how she never reached out when Dad got sick, or even after he passed. She was acting like everything was fine, like the years in between didn't matter. And then she got to the real reason she came back. I heard you have an apartment now, she said, giving me a hopeful look. I was wondering if Max and I could stay there for a while. We don't have anywhere else to go, and it would really help us out. I felt my jaw tighten. She wanted me to help her after all these years? I glanced at Max. He looked uncomfortable, and I couldn't blame him. This whole situation was messed up. I don't know, Mom, I said. It's been a long time, and you never reached out. Not even when Dad was sick. She sighed, her face turning serious. I know, and I'm sorry. But I'm trying to make things right now. We just need a place to stay until we get back on our feet. I promise it won't be long. I stared at her, trying to decide if she was being genuine or if this was just another one of her schemes. In the end, I looked at Max again. It wasn't his fault that she was like this, and I didn't want him to pay for her mistakes. Fine, I said, but only for a few months, and you have to pay for the utilities. Her face lit up like she'd just won something. Thank you, Alex. We'll pay rent too once we get settled. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a huge mistake. As I walked out of the cafe, I knew things were about to get complicated. At first, things were all right. Mom and Mark moved into the apartment, and for a couple of weeks, it was quiet. I didn't hear much from them, and I figured they were settling in, trying to get back on their feet like they said they would. Honestly, I was trying to keep my distance. I didn't want to get too involved. I told myself it was the smart thing to do, keeping some space, you know. But then, things started to change. Little things, but enough for me to notice. Mom would text me out of nowhere, asking about money for groceries or complaining about how the water bill was higher than she expected. I reminded her, Mom, you're only paying utilities, not rent. She'd always respond with something like, I know, but it's still tough right now. I'd tell her I understood, but deep down, it bugged me. It felt like the beginning of something I wasn't ready for. One afternoon, she called me while I was at work. Alex, I need to talk to you. Her voice had that edge, the one I remembered from when I was younger, like she was about to ask for something big. I stepped outside and leaned against the building, already feeling the headache coming. What's up? Listen, Mark's school is asking for more fees than I thought, and he needs new books. It's just, things are really tight right now. She paused, like she was waiting for me to say something. When I didn't, she added, I was hoping you could help out, just this once. I felt my jaw tighten. Mom, I already gave you the apartment for free. You said you'd handle the utilities. And I appreciate that, I really do, she said, her voice smooth like she was trying to sell me something. But we're struggling. I'm doing everything I can. It's just a little more help, that's all. I stood there staring at the sidewalk. I could feel my frustration building up, but I tried to keep it cool. I'll think about it, I mumbled, and hung up before she could push any further. A few days later, I decided to drop by the apartment unannounced. I wanted to see how things were going, and honestly, I needed to get a read on the situation. I knocked on the door, and it took a while before Mark opened it. He looked surprised to see me, and there was this awkward pause before he stepped aside and let me in. The place was a mess. Boxes everywhere, dishes piled up in the sink, and clothes thrown over the couch. It was like they hadn't even tried to settle in properly. Mom came out of one of the bedrooms looking annoyed. "Alex, you should have called first," she said, crossing her arms. "I wanted to check in," I said, glancing around. "What's going on here?" She waved her hand like it was no big deal. "Oh, we're just still unpacking. It's been busy." Her tone was casual, but I could tell she was irritated that I showed up without warning. "Mom, it's been over a month. You said this was temporary, remember?" I felt the frustration bubbling up again. "You're still living here rent-free, and I haven't seen you paying for the utilities yet." She rolled her eyes. "I know, Alex. We're working on it, okay? Things are just harder than I expected." I took a deep breath, trying not to lose it. "It's not just about the bills, Mom. You need to get serious about moving on. I can't keep covering for you." She glared at me, and for a moment it felt like I was 13 again, standing in the kitchen while she tore into Dad. "I gave up everything for you," she snapped. "And this is how you repay me? By making me feel like a burden?" I didn't even know what to say. I felt my hands clench into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I'm not making you feel anything, Mom. I'm just telling you the truth." She huffed and walked back into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Mark was still standing there, looking uncomfortable. "Sorry, man," he mumbled, staring at the floor. I shook my head. "It's not your fault." I felt bad for him. He was stuck in the middle of all this, and it wasn't fair. But at the same time, I couldn't just let them walk all over me. After that, things got worse. Mom started spreading stories to the rest of the family, telling them I was being cold-hearted and stingy despite everything she'd done for me. I'd get calls from my aunt, my cousin, even some old family friends, all of them asking why I wasn't helping my mom. It was like she was rallying everyone against me, twisting the story to make herself look like the victim. One night, I got a call from my aunt. She launched into this whole speech about family loyalty and how I should be grateful for everything my mom sacrificed for me. I let her talk for a while, just listening and feeling my blood boil. "Aunt Debbie," I finally said, cutting her off, "you don't know the whole story. She abandoned us. She left me and Dad when I was a kid. I'm the one who's been picking up the pieces, not her." There was silence on the other end for a moment. "That was a long time ago, Alex," she said softly. "People change. You should give her another chance." I clenched my jaw, feeling the anger bubbling up. I've given her plenty of chances. She's the same person she's always been, manipulative and selfish. I hung up, feeling more alone than ever. It was like no one remembered what really happened or they didn't care. And the more she talked, the more everyone seemed to turn against me. Even people I hadn't seen in years were suddenly reaching out, acting like they knew what was going on when they didn't have a clue. The final straw came when I saw a post on Facebook. Mom had written this long status about how I was refusing to support her and Mark, about how she was struggling to get back on her feet, and that I was heartless. The comments flooded in, all these people backing her up, saying things like, "How could she do that to her own mother?" And "Family comes first, no matter what." I felt my stomach drop as I read the comments. These people had no idea what really happened, but they were quick to judge. It felt like everyone was against me, and there was nothing I could do to change their minds. Later that week, I got an email about unpaid utilities. She hadn't paid a single bill since she moved in. I was done. I grabbed my phone and called her. "Mom, we need to talk about the bills. You agreed to pay for the utilities and you haven't paid anything." She sighed loudly like I was being unreasonable. "Oh, Alex, come on. You've got plenty of money from the shop. Can't you just cover it?" I felt my grip tighten on the phone. "That's not the point, and you know it. We had an agreement." "Agreements change," she said, like it was no big deal. "You should be helping your family, not keeping score." I couldn't take it anymore. "I've helped you enough. You need to figure things out, or you're going to have to leave." She laughed, this bitter, humorless laugh. "Go ahead and try, Alex. See how far that gets you." I hung up, my hands shaking. I knew then that I'd have to take things further. She wasn't going to leave on her own, and I wasn't going to let her drag me down with her. It was time to do something about it. After that call with Mom, I knew I couldn't let things go on the way they were. It was clear she wasn't going to change, and if I kept letting her stay, I'd just be giving her more opportunities to mess things up for me. I spent the next few days researching my options, trying to figure out how to evict her legally. I was done with her games, and I was done letting her walk all over me. I booked an appointment with a lawyer. When I walked into his office, I felt this mix of nerves and relief. I'd never done anything like this before, and it felt weird, like I was betraying my own family. But at the same time, I knew I didn't have a choice. I couldn't keep letting her make me the bad guy while she took advantage of everything I'd worked for. The lawyer, Mr. Johnson, was a straightforward kind of guy. I told him the whole story, and he didn't seem surprised at all. "You've got every right to evict her," he said, flipping through the notes he took, "especially since she's not paying rent and has no formal lease agreement. She's considered a guest at this point." I felt a small weight lift off my shoulders. "So, what do I need to do?" I asked, leaning forward. He handed me a form. "This is the eviction notice. You give her this, and she has 30 days to vacate the apartment. If she doesn't leave, we'll go through the court system to get her out." It sounded simple enough, but I knew it wouldn't be. Mom wasn't the type to just pack up and leave because someone told her to. Still, it was a start, and it was more than I'd had before. That weekend, I drove over to the apartment with the notice in hand. I tried to keep my nerves in check, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. Either she'd accept it and go quietly, or things were about to get even messier. When I knocked on the door, Mark answered again. "Hey, Alex," he said, his face all cautious. "What's up?" "Is Mom home?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as I could. He nodded and stepped aside. I walked in, and there she was, sitting on the couch like she didn't have a care in the world. When she saw me, she raised an eyebrow. "Oh, it's you. What, no heads up again?" I ignored her comment and pulled out the eviction notice. "We need to talk." Her eyes narrowed. "What's that?" "It's an eviction notice," I said, holding it out to her. "You have 30 days to move out." The room went silent. For a second, I thought she might actually take it, but then she scoffed, crossing her arms. "You're kicking your own mother out? After everything I've done for you?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "You haven't paid the bills, you've lied to everyone about me, and you've made no effort to get back on your feet like you promised. I can't keep supporting you like this." She glared at me, her face twisting in anger. "This is how you repay me? By throwing me and Mark out on the street?" "It's not my job to support you, Mom," I said, feeling the frustration build up. "You made your choices. Now you need to deal with them." She stood up, and I could see the fury in her eyes. "You think you're so high and mighty now, don't you? Just because you have a little money and some property, you think you're better than us." I shook my head. "This isn't about that. This is about you taking advantage of me." She snatched the paper from my hand, crumpling it up. "Fine," she snapped, "but don't think this is over. You'll regret this, Alex." I didn't respond. I just turned and walked out, my hands shaking as I reached for the door. As I left, I caught Mark's eye. He looked so uncomfortable, like he wanted to say something but couldn't. I felt bad for him, but there was nothing I could do. This wasn't his fight. It was between me and her. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. Mom doubled down, going around telling anyone who would listen that I was kicking her out on the street and abandoning my family. She made it sound like I was some heartless monster who didn't care about anyone but myself. It hurt seeing the comments and the messages from people who believed her, but I tried to push it out of my mind. I knew the truth, and I had to stay focused. With the eviction notice served, I started getting updates from Mr. Johnson about the next steps. It was a waiting game now, just counting down the days. But then, the phone calls started. Every couple of days, Mom would call, either begging me to reconsider or angrily accusing me of turning my back on her. One day, she left a voicemail that said, "If you think you can just get rid of me, you've got another thing coming. You don't know what I'm capable of." I deleted the message, but the threat hung in my mind. I didn't know if she was serious or just trying to scare me, but it worked. I felt on edge, like something bad was around the corner. 2 weeks in, I got a call from Mr. Johnson again. "Alex, she's trying to fight the eviction," he said. "She's claiming you promised her the apartment and that she's entitled to stay." I felt my stomach drop. "Can she do that?" "It's unlikely she'll win," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "But it means we'll have to go to court." Great, I thought. Just what I needed, more drama. But I knew I couldn't back down now. If I let her stay, she'd never leave, and things would only get worse. I agreed to move forward with the court process, even though the thought of facing her in court made my head spin. The day of the hearing finally arrived. I felt like my insides were twisting into knots as I walked into the courtroom. Mom and Mark were already there. She looked upset, all red-eyed and teary, like she was trying to play the victim. Mark just looked miserable, and I felt bad for him, but I had to remind myself that this wasn't about him. The hearing wasn't long, but it felt like hours. Mom put on this whole act about how she was struggling, how she was just trying to reconnect with her family and build a life for her and Mark. She even cried a few times, and I could see some people in the courtroom giving her sympathetic looks. But then it was my turn. My lawyer laid out the facts. How she hadn't paid anything, how she'd agreed to the terms, and how she'd been spreading lies about me to family and friends. I watched as the judge's expression went from neutral to annoyed. He wasn't buying her act. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. Mom was ordered to leave the apartment within the next 2 weeks, and if she didn't, she'd face legal consequences. I felt a rush of relief, but also a heaviness. I'd won, but it didn't feel like a victory. As we left the courtroom, I caught up with Mark. Hey, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm sorry it came to this. He looked up at me, his eyes sad. I know. I'm sorry too. He paused, then added, I wish things were different. Me too, I said. If you ever need anything, you know how to reach me. He nodded, and we parted ways. As I walked to my car, I felt the weight lift a little. It wasn't over, but it was a step in the right direction. Maybe now I could finally start to move on.